Coming live from the studio, this is All Sports with Gerardo. Thank you for watching another episode of All Sports. This is your host Gerardo, and all I talk is sports. On the show today, I am going to talk about NFL football. Before I start the show, I hope you all had a great week. To start off with NFL football, on this episode of All Sports with Gerardo, it's going to be all about NFL football and the 2020 NFL Draft. To start off with NFL football, the 2020 NFL Draft was supposed to be in Las Vegas this year. Due to the coronavirus pandemic, the 2020 NFL Draft wasn't in Las Vegas and the draft was fully virtual. Team officials for all 32 teams had to do the NFL Draft from their homes since they were not allowed to go to the team's facility or work in groups. The 2020 NFL Draft was from April 23rd through the 25th. So if we take a look at the 2020 NFL Draft, it was supposed to be in Las Vegas, but due to the coronavirus, it was not in Las Vegas and it had to be held virtual. Basically, all 32 teams had to work from their homes, and team officials had to do the draft via the internet, social media, through Skype, Zoom. The 2020 NFL Draft is definitely going to be in the history books, especially in the NFL and for all previous drafts, and even for future drafts that happen down the road. There's no doubt that this 2020 NFL Draft definitely made history. There's definitely going to be books written about it. It definitely made NFL history. Not by just the stats that came along with the 2020 NFL Draft in regards to players that were in this draft class, but also because of the way this draft was conducted and formatted compared to previous drafts. And the 2020 NFL Draft was supposed to be like most of the other previous drafts. But the 2020 NFL Draft is definitely going to be remembered as being different and conducted in a different format compared to previous drafts. So there's definitely going to be a lot of books written on how the 2020 NFL Draft was conducted. The draft's also going to be remembered by how successful it was conducted. Many people had their doubts on how this draft was going to have to be conducted and formatted due to the coronavirus pandemic and the draft not being held in Las Vegas in 2020, and this draft wasn't held in a city like the previous drafts had been. But the way that the 2020 NFL Draft played out, by the way it was conducted and formatted, a lot of people had their doubts about this, but it was actually pretty successful on how it was formatted and how it played out. So that is definitely one thing that the 2020 NFL Draft is going to be remembered by, is how it was conducted. Also, the 2020 NFL Draft is going to be remembered by all the stats in regards to players that were drafted, the certain universities that players were drafted from, and also the amount of players in this draft class, especially for certain positions, regardless if it's on offense or defense. So there's no doubt that the 2020 NFL Draft definitely made history. It's definitely going to be remembered and talked about going into the future. Right now I'm going to talk about the 2020 NFL Draft, and I am going to give you a recap of the 2020 NFL Draft. To start off, the 2020 NFL Draft was from April 23rd through the 25th. Believe it or not, the 2020 NFL Draft was very successful, even though many people had their doubts on how this draft was going to be conducted and formatted, since it was going to be held virtually. Since team officials for all 32 teams had to use the internet, social media, Skype, Zoom, and all this technology to conduct and have the 2020 NFL Draft still take place. By the way this draft was formatted and by the way it played out, the format of how this draft had to be conducted was very successful. Even though the 2020 NFL Draft was different compared to previous drafts, it's definitely going to be remembered, but also it's going to be talked about because of the way it was done, but also because of the way it was done, it was very successful after the conclusion of the 2020 NFL Draft. And many people had their doubts that the 2020 NFL Draft couldn't happen for its original scheduled dates, even though it was supposed to be in Las Vegas this year. And even though it wasn't in Las Vegas this year due to the coronavirus pandemic, the NFL Draft still took place from April 23rd through the 25th, and it was held virtually. But believe it or not, many people around the world, regardless if they're a fan of the NFL or other sport leagues, were happy. And even people inside the NFL were happy that the NFL was able to pull off and do the 2020 NFL Draft because of the coronavirus pandemic that's happening right now. The reason why fans were happy that the NFL was able to do the 2020 NFL Draft was because it was a live, real event that was happening right now. And for the last few weeks, and even for the next few weeks, regardless of what league or sporting event it is, most of us are not going to see a live, real sporting event because of the situation right now. And by having the 2020 NFL Draft take place, and it was a live event, believe me, it made the situation that's currently happening right now a lot better. We all hope that sometime in the next few weeks, we can see sports return. But it's been hard for the last few weeks not seeing any sports, regardless of what league or sporting event it is. And the only thing we have seen that is the closest to any type of sporting events or games is games that have already happened in the past that are being replayed on TV. But believe me, it's great to see that happening right now, regardless of what league it is. But we all want to see live, real games happening right now, or that were supposed to happen. And hopefully we all get that opportunity, regardless of what league or sporting event it is, sometime in the next few weeks. And believe me, when that happens, it's not going to matter what sport it is, as long as it's a live, real game, matchup, or tournament. Believe me, it's going to be great to see sports return back. And it's going to make a lot of people happy, regardless of what sport it is. And we definitely want to see some type of sport play sometime in the next few weeks. So if we take a look at the 2020 NFL Draft, right now I'm going to give you a recap of the first round. From the first pick all the way to the 32nd pick in the first round. With the first pick in the 2020 NFL Draft, the Bengals selected quarterback Joe Burrow. The Redskins had the second pick and they selected defensive end Chase Young. So before the 2020 NFL Draft happened, regardless of who it was, or if you conducted a mock draft or gave predictions of what was going to happen in the 2020 NFL Draft, especially in the first round, it was almost 100% guarantee with the first pick that the Bengals had, they were going to select Joe Burrow. And with the Redskins having the second pick, they were going to select Chase Young. After the Bengals were to select Joe Burrow and the Redskins were to select Chase Young, for the rest of the draft, especially in the first round, who knows what would have happened. No matter who it was, or no matter who you are, we could have all conducted so many mock drafts and gave so many predictions, and really only the first and second pick were a guarantee. Everything else was up in the air, especially if teams were to go a different direction or teams were going to trade up or down, which would throw off any mock draft or any prediction you make, regardless of who you are. So with the Bengals having the first pick, they selected quarterback Joe Burrow. After the end of last season, the Bengals kind of knew that they were going to move on from quarterback Andy Dalton, and they were going to go a different direction. And since they had the worst record and they knew they were going to get the first pick in the draft, they were going to select the best available quarterback that would be in the 2020 NFL draft class, which landed up being Joe Burrow. So the Bengals selected Joe Burrow, and basically the Bengals are hoping Joe Burrow can be their franchise quarterback going into the future, and they want to build around him, especially on offense. And the Bengals are hoping that they can be a better team on offense and defense this season and going into the future. And the Bengals are hoping Joe Burrow can be their franchise quarterback. The Redskins had the second pick, and they landed up selecting Chase Young. If you look at all the top prospects that were in the draft class for 2020, if you looked at every single player, Chase Young was probably the best prospect. And there's no doubt that he was one of the best, or the best, defensive player in this draft class. The Redskins need a lot of help on offense or defense, and they could have selected almost any prospect in this draft. But they landed up selecting the best defensive player and also one of the top prospects in this draft class. They selected Chase Young, and they're hoping that Chase Young will improve their defense. And just like when the 49ers drafted Nick Bosa in the 2019 NFL Draft, there's no doubt that Nick Bosa was one of the best defensive players in that draft class. And he definitely made a huge impact for the 49ers defense. And the Redskins are hoping that Chase Young can make an impact on the Redskins defense. The Lions had the third pick, and they landed up selecting cornerback Jeff Okudah. The Lions could have went offense or defense with their draft pick. They definitely needed help on improving their offense or defense. But after the Lions traded cornerback Darius Slay, the Lions needed another cornerback to be a replacement. So the Lions made the decision of going after one of the best cornerbacks in this year's draft class, and they landed up drafting Jeff Okudah. The Giants had the 4th pick, and they landed up drafting offensive tackle Andrew Thomas. The Giants could have went either direction with their draft pick. They could have went offense or defense. They definitely need to improve both sides of the football. For the Giants, there was a great chance that they were going to try to improve their offense so their offense can be better for quarterback Daniel Jones. And they landed up selecting an offensive tackle. Now, originally, when you would have done a mock draft for who the Giants were going to select, an offensive tackle was definitely a position they needed. But no one would have predicted that the Giants were going to select Andrew Thomas. So they did go offensive tackle, but they definitely surprised everybody on who they selected. The Dolphins had the 5th pick, and they landed up drafting quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. So the Dolphins and the Chargers could have went either direction. The Dolphins had the 5th pick, and the Chargers had the 6th pick. There was a great chance that the Chargers were going to pass on one of these quarterbacks and choose a defensive player. The Chargers thought that Tyrod Taylor could be their quarterback going into the future after Phillip Rivers left. So many people were speculating that the Chargers were going to pass on one of these quarterbacks and draft a defensive player. But the Chargers landed up drafting one of the quarterbacks. And for the Dolphins and the Chargers, it could have went either direction. The Dolphins could have selected Tua Tagovailoa or Justin Herbert, and the Chargers could have selected Tua Tagovailoa or Justin Herbert. Just depending on what the Dolphins did was going to determine what quarterback the Chargers were going to choose if they did choose a quarterback. So the Dolphins had the 5th pick, and they landed up choosing quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. The Chargers had the 6th pick, and they landed up choosing quarterback Justin Herbert. For the Dolphins, they selected quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. There's no doubt that Tua Tagovailoa was one of the best quarterbacks in college football, especially when he played for Alabama. Now, many teams were hesitating on picking Tua Tagovailoa because of his injury list and the amount of injuries he has suffered, especially during his college football career. So that was a red flag for a lot of teams. Now, if Tua Tagovailoa didn't have that long injury list from when he was playing college football, with the way that Tua Tagovailoa played college football for Alabama when he was on the field, if he didn't have this injury list, there's no doubt that Tua Tagovailoa would have been the 1st overall pick instead of Joe Burrow. But because of this injury list that Tua Tagovailoa has, many people were speculating that Tua Tagovailoa was going to fall even out of the top 5 or the top 10 of the 2020 NFL Draft. He was still going to be selected in the 1st round, but many were speculating that he was going to fall in the 1st round. But the Dolphins landed up drafting Tua Tagovailoa and taking a chance. And the Dolphins are hoping that Tua Tagovailoa can be their franchise quarterback going into the future. And after the Chargers moved on from Phillip Rivers, the Chargers are also hoping that Justin Herbert can be their franchise quarterback going into the future. The Panthers had the 7th pick, and they landed up selecting defensive tackle Derek Brown. Believe it or not, in the 2020 NFL Draft, all the draft picks that the Panthers had, all the players they selected were defensive players. I was a little bit surprised on what the Panthers did. They did select a great defensive player with the 7th overall pick. But I'm really surprised that they passed on Isaiah Simmons. My opinion, I believe the Panthers should have drafted Isaiah Simmons. But they still ended up drafting a great defensive player. The Cardinals had the 8th pick, and they landed up selecting linebacker Isaiah Simmons. So the Cardinals could have went either way. They could have selected a player on offense or defense. If it would have been an offensive player, it could have been an offensive tackle or even a wide receiver. If not, the Cardinals were definitely going to select a defensive player or even an offensive tackle. With Isaiah Simmons falling into the Cardinals' hands, there was just no way the Cardinals could pass on Isaiah Simmons, so the Cardinals landed up selecting Isaiah Simmons. So with the 8th pick, after the Lions, the Giants, and the Panthers passed on Isaiah Simmons, the Cardinals landed up selecting Isaiah Simmons. The Jaguars had the 9th pick, and they landed up selecting cornerback C.J. Henderson. So after the Jaguars traded cornerback Jalen Ramsey and A.J. Brown, the Jaguars definitely needed help on defense. And they definitely needed a replacement for Jalen Ramsey and A.J. Brown at the cornerback position. So the Jaguars landed up selecting a defensive player, and they landed up selecting a cornerback that could replace Jalen Ramsey and A.J. Brown. And the Jaguars selected cornerback C.J. Henderson. And C.J. Henderson was also one of the best cornerbacks in this year's draft class. But with the 9th pick that the Jaguars had, there was a great chance that the Jaguars were going to select a defensive player, even if it wasn't a cornerback, because the Jaguars definitely need help on improving their defense. The Browns had the 10th pick, and they landed up selecting offensive tackle Jedrick Wills. So if we take a look at this pick, the Browns were going to select an offensive tackle, but they definitely surprised a lot of people on which offensive tackle they selected. But they definitely wanted to improve their offensive line for Baker Mayfield. The Jets had the 11th pick, and they selected offensive tackle Muhai Becon. So the Jets had two options with their draft pick. Either get a wide receiver to help Sam Darnold, or get an offensive tackle to help protect Sam Darnold. The Jets could have went either way, and they landed up selecting an offensive tackle to help protect Sam Darnold at the quarterback position. The Raiders had the 12th pick, and they selected wide receiver Henry Ruggs III. With this pick that the Raiders had, the Raiders were definitely going to select a wide receiver that could help Derek Carr score more points for the Raiders. The Raiders surprised a lot of people by selecting Henry Ruggs III. The Raiders were more linked to selecting Jerry Jeudy or CeeDee Lamb, so they definitely surprised a lot of people by selecting Henry Ruggs III. But there was no doubt that the Raiders were going to select one of the top wide receivers in this year's draft class with the 12th pick to help Derek Carr on the offense. The Buccaneers had the 13th pick and they landed up selecting offensive tackle Tristan Wirfs. So after the Buccaneers were able to get Tom Brady during free agency, many people were predicting that the Buccaneers were going to try to help Tom Brady improve the offense, but also get protection for Tom Brady, so Tom Brady has protection when he's throwing the football. And that's the direction that the Buccaneers went by selecting an offensive tackle. The 49ers had the 14th pick. They landed up selecting defensive lineman Javon Quinlaw. Now the 49ers, with their pick, they could have went either direction. They could have chosen an offensive player or a defensive player. Now after Emmanuel Sanders left during free agency, many people were predicting that the 49ers were going to go after one of the top wide receivers after they lost Emmanuel Sanders. But the 49ers landed up taking a different direction by choosing a defensive player to help improve their defense, so they have one of the top defenses again this season. The Broncos had the 15th pick and they landed up selecting wide receiver Jerry Jeudy. Many people knew that the Broncos were going to select the best available player with the pick they had in the first round. It was just going to depend on what player was available when it was their turn to pick. Many people were surprised that Jerry Jeudy was still on the board. So the Broncos landed up selecting the best available player, which was wide receiver Jerry Jeudy. The wide receiver position was definitely a need for the Broncos, and the Broncos needed to find and get their number 2 wide receiver and get more help for Drew Lock, so Drew Lock had another receiver to throw the football to, so the Broncos would be better on offense and score more points this season and going into the future. And the Broncos landed up selecting a wide receiver to help out Drew Lock on offense. The Falcons had the 16th pick and they landed up selecting cornerback AJ Terrell. So after the Falcons improved their offense during free agency, it was now time for the Falcons to improve their defense through the draft. And that is the direction the Falcons went with their draft pick. The Cowboys had the 17th pick and they landed up selecting wide receiver CeeDee Lamb. Now for the Cowboys, a lot of people were surprised that CeeDee Lamb was still on the board. So the Cowboys landed up selecting the best available player and they landed up selecting a wide receiver that could help out Dak Prescott on offense and make the Cowboys offense better so they could potentially score more points and also win more games. So with CeeDee Lamb still on the board, the Cowboys landed up selecting CeeDee Lamb. Also, since their divisional rival, the Eagles, needed a wide receiver, and they were looking at CeeDee Lamb, and if CeeDee Lamb would have still been on the board, the Eagles would have drafted him. The Eagles had done a lot to the Cowboys in the past by selecting certain players through free agency or the draft. So it was now time for the Cowboys to do the payback to the Eagles. And in the 2020 NFL Draft, the Cowboys landed up selecting one of the top wide receivers in this year's draft class after he fell into their hands, and they landed up selecting a top wide receiver that could potentially help improve the Cowboys' offense this season and going into the future. The Dolphins had the 18th pick, and they landed up selecting offensive tackle Austin Jackson. With the Dolphins improving their offense and defense during free agency, the Dolphins wanted to do the same thing in the draft. And with this pick, and with their previous pick, the Dolphins definitely wanted to improve their offense, so their offense has a lot of potential of being better, playing better, and scoring a lot of points going into the future. And they landed up selecting an offensive tackle. The Raiders had the 19th pick, and they landed up selecting cornerback Damon Arnto. The Raiders definitely wanted to improve their team both on offense and defense, and with this pick, the Raiders landed up improving their defense at the cornerback position. The Jaguars had the 20th pick, and the Jaguars landed up selecting linebacker K'Lavon Cashon. So after the Jaguars have lost a lot of their great defensive players through free agency this offseason and in the last few off seasons, the Jaguars need to rebuild their defense. And with their first pick and with their second pick in the first round of this year's draft, the Jaguars definitely wanted to improve their defense by adding some of the top prospects in this year's draft class, especially on the defensive side. And the Jaguars are hoping with the players they selected on defense that their defense will be better and improve for this season and going into the future. The Eagles had the 21st pick, and they landed up selecting wide receiver Jalen Reagor. So when it was time for the Eagles to select a player, a lot of people were expecting the Eagles to select a wide receiver that could help Carson Wentz and the Eagles offense be better and score a lot of points, and that is the direction that the Eagles went. The Vikings had the 22nd pick, and they landed up selecting wide receiver Justin Jefferson. So after the Vikings traded Stephon Diggs to the Bills, the Vikings needed a replacement at the wide receiver position for Stephon Diggs, and they landed up selecting one of the top wide receivers in this year's draft class, which was Justin Jefferson. And since Justin Jefferson fell into the Vikings' hands, there was just no way the Vikings could pass on Justin Jefferson, and since they needed someone to replace Stephon Diggs, they landed up selecting Justin Jefferson. The Chargers had the 23rd pick, and they landed up selecting linebacker Kenneth Murray. So with the Chargers drafting a quarterback with the 6th pick, which was Justin Herbert, many people were thinking that the Chargers were going to pass on one of the top quarterbacks in this year's draft class, since they thought Tyrod Taylor would be their franchise quarterback. But after the Chargers drafted a quarterback with their first pick in the 2020 NFL Draft, the next pick that they had, they were definitely going to select a defensive player that could improve their defense and have an impact on their defense, so the Chargers defense will be better this season and going into the future. The Saints had the 24th pick, and they landed up selecting center Cesar Ruiz. So the Saints definitely wanted to improve their offense, especially for Drew Brees, and they landed up choosing a player to help protect Drew Brees. The 49ers had the 25th pick, and they selected wide receiver Brandon Oku. So after the 49ers passed on one of the top wide receivers in this year's draft class with their first draft pick in the first round, and after the 49ers lost Emmanuel Sanders during free agency, people were expecting at some point, since this draft class had a lot of wide receiver depth, that the 49ers would add a wide receiver to replace Emmanuel Sanders, which they landed up doing with the 25th pick. The Packers had the 26th pick, and they landed up selecting quarterback Jordan Love. So originally, a quarterback like Jordan Love that was going to be in this year's draft class after Joe Burrow, Tua Tagovailoa, and Justin Herbert were drafted. Jordan Love and the rest of the quarterbacks were quarterbacks that were going to be drafted by teams so that quarterback could be a potential replacement for the current veteran quarterback that team has. With my predictions and with many mock drafts that many other individuals did, the Packers was one of the teams that we all had linked as to being one of the teams that would draft one of these quarterbacks that could potentially be a replacement for Aaron Rodgers once the Packers decide to move on from Aaron Rodgers or once Aaron Rodgers retires. And many people didn't have Jordan Love linked to the Packers. Jordan Love was more linked to the Patriots or the Saints. But the Packers were one of the teams that had the potential of drafting one of these quarterbacks that could be a potential replacement for Aaron Rodgers down the road. So, with the 26th pick, the Packers landed up selecting quarterback Jordan Love, and he will likely be Aaron Rodgers' replacement sometime down the road. The Seahawks had the 27th pick, and they landed up selecting linebacker Jordan Brooks. With this draft pick, the Seahawks landed up choosing a defensive player that has the potential of helping the Seahawks on defense and making an impact on the Seahawks defense so they can be better for this season and going into the future. The Ravens had the 28th pick, and they landed up selecting linebacker Patrick Queens. So with this draft pick, the Ravens landed up choosing a defensive player that can make an impact on their defense and also improve their defense for this season and going into the future. The Titans had the 29th pick, and they landed up selecting offensive tackle Isaiah Wilson. So with this draft pick, the Titans decided to choose an offensive player that could help protect Ryan Tannehill at the quarterback position. The Dolphins had the 30th pick, and they landed up selecting cornerback Noah Onoduhi. So with the amount of draft picks that the Dolphins had in this year's draft, and they had 3 in the first round, after the Dolphins improved their team on offense and defense through free agency, the Dolphins wanted to do the same thing in the draft. And with the amount of draft picks that they had, there was no doubt they could improve their team through the draft on offense and defense as well. With this draft pick, that the Dolphins had, they landed up choosing a defensive player that could help them at the cornerback position, and this player also has the potential of improving and making the Dolphins defense better for this season and going into the future. The Vikings had the 31st pick, and they landed up selecting cornerback Jeff Gradney. So with this draft pick, the Vikings definitely wanted to improve their defense, especially their cornerback position. So they landed up choosing a cornerback with this draft pick that has the potential of improving their defense, especially at the cornerback position for this season and going into the future. And with the final pick in the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft, the Chiefs had the 32nd pick, and they landed up selecting running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire. After the Chiefs were one of the best teams in the NFL last season, and they won Super Bowl 54. There's no doubt that the Chiefs are great on offense and defense, especially on offense, which is led by quarterback Patrick Mahomes. And we all know what Patrick Mahomes can do. The only help that the Chiefs really needed was at the running back position. So with the 32nd pick, the Chiefs landed up selecting a running back that can help improve the Chiefs' offense at the running back position for this season and going into the future. And the Chiefs are hoping that after they address the running back position with their first draft pick in the first round of this year's draft, the Chiefs are just hoping that they select the right running back that can improve that Chiefs offense and make an impact on the Chiefs offense this season and going into the future. And really, the running back position was really the only position the Chiefs had to address in free agency or in the draft. The running back position was really the only need that the Chiefs needed after winning Super Bowl 54. And the Chiefs are hoping that this running back will have an impact for their team this season and going into the future, especially for their offense, which is led by Patrick Mahomes. And after the Chiefs won Super Bowl 54, the Chiefs are hoping that now that they have a great offense, which is led by Patrick Mahomes, they can continue having winning seasons, but also winning more Super Bowls going into the future. So with this draft pick, the Chiefs landed up selecting a running back that has the potential of making their offense better, especially at the running back position this season and going into the future. So that was the highlights of the first round in the 2020 NFL Draft. In the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft, there were not that many trades that happened with teams moving up or down in the first round. Also, there were a few teams that traded in and out of the first round. There were also teams that moved up and down in the first round. And we also had a few teams that did not have a first round pick. But overall, the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft was a great round, and a lot of great players were selected in the first round. And most of the top prospects in the 2020 draft class were selected in the first round. Overall, the 2020 NFL Draft was another great NFL draft. This draft class had a lot of great prospects, a lot of top prospects, and the 2020 NFL Draft was known for having a lot of wide receiver depth. No matter if it was the first round or any other round in the 2020 NFL Draft. But overall, the 2020 NFL Draft was a great NFL Draft, especially the first round was the best round in this year's draft. So here are the highlights from the 2020 NFL Draft. There were not a lot of trades that happened in the first round of the draft, especially in the first half of the first round. There were not a lot of trades that happened in all of the rounds in this year's draft. Teams that have never had the first overall pick in the NFL Draft includes the Broncos, Seahawks, Ravens, and the Jaguars. A record of 13 wide receivers were drafted in the first two rounds of the draft. Also, this draft class had a lot of wide receiver depth, and the 2020 NFL Draft was known for the amount of wide receivers it had and for the wide receiver depth. The Panthers used all 7 of their 2020 draft picks on defensive players, which is the most draft picks used on defensive players in the Common Draft era. For the first time in the Common Draft era and for the third straight year in the NFL Draft, the first overall pick has been 3 straight Heisman Trophy winners from the previous college season, and they have been quarterbacks drafted with the first pick in the draft. This includes Joe Burrow in 2020, Kyler Murray in 2019, and Baker Mayfield in 2018. For the first time in the Common Draft era, Oklahoma has been the first team to have a quarterback drafted in the first 2 rounds in 3 straight drafts. This includes Jalen Hurts in 2020, Kyler Murray in 2019, and Baker Mayfield in 2018. For the first time in the Common Draft era, the first 3 players drafted in the 2020 NFL Draft played for Ohio State. This includes Joe Burrow, the first pick, Chase Young, the second pick, and Jeff Okudah, the third pick. 14 LSU players were selected in the 2020 NFL Draft. The 2020 LSU draft class tied the 2004 Ohio State draft class for having the most players selected from one school in the 7-round draft era since 1994. The SEC is the first conference to have 6 players selected in the top 10 of a single NFL draft. 15 SEC players were selected in the first round of the 2020 NFL Draft, which is the most players from one conference taken in the first round in NFL Draft history. LSU had 5 first-round draft picks, Alabama had 4 first-round draft picks, Ohio State had 3 first-round draft picks, and Auburn, Georgia, Oklahoma, and TCU had 2 first-round draft picks. The colleges with the most picks in this year's draft included LSU with 14 draft picks, Michigan and Ohio State with 10 draft picks, Alabama with 9 draft picks, Clemson, Florida, Georgia, and Utah with 7 draft picks, and Auburn and Notre Dame with 6 draft picks. Some other big names that got drafted in the later rounds includes the Bengals had the 33rd pick, and they landed up selecting wide receiver T. Higgins. So after the Bengals selected quarterback Joe Burrow, the Bengals wanted to add a receiver that could help Joe Burrow on offense and a receiver that has the potential of playing on the other side of A.J. Green. And the Bengals are hoping by selecting wide receiver T. Higgins, since he basically fell into his hands, the Bengals are hoping that T. Higgins can make a huge impact on the Bengals offense, just like A.J. Green has in the last few years. And after the Bengals selected Joe Burrow, the Bengals wanted to get help for Joe Burrow, and they also wanted to get another receiver for Joe Burrow, so the Bengals have the opportunity of being better on offense, scoring a lot of points, and also winning more games this season and going into the future. The Lions had the 35th pick, and they landed up selecting running back DeAndre Swift. So the Lions wanted to improve their offense, and they landed up drafting a running back that can help Matthew Stafford in the Lions offense be better, score a lot of points, and potentially win more games. The Giants had the 36th pick, and they landed up selecting safety Xavier McKinney. So the Giants definitely wanted to improve their defense, and they added a defensive player that's going to play at the safety position that has the potential of improving the Giants' defense this season and going into the future. The Colts had the 41st pick, and they landed up selecting running back Jonathan Taylor. So the Colts definitely wanted to improve their offense by adding a running back that could help Phillip Rivers on the offense and have the potential of scoring more points and being better on offense so they can win more games. The Jaguars had the 42nd pick, and they landed up selecting wide receiver Lishada Sentua. So the Jaguars definitely wanted to improve their offense, and they landed up adding a wide receiver that could improve their offense and potentially score more points so the Jaguars can win more games this season and going into the future. The Broncos had the 46th pick, and they landed up selecting wide receiver KJ Hamler. So the Broncos landed up adding another wide receiver with this draft pick that could help Drew Lock on the Broncos offense, and they wanted to get another receiver for Drew Lock so the Broncos offense can be better this season and going into the future, and so they can score more points, win more games potentially, but also they want more receivers and more options for Drew Lock so the Broncos offense will be better this season and going into the future. The Cowboys had the 51st pick, and they landed up selecting cornerback Tevin Diggs. So after the Cowboys moved on from their former cornerback, the Cowboys definitely needed another cornerback that could replace their former cornerback. So with this draft pick, the Cowboys addressed the cornerback position by adding a cornerback that could replace the former cornerback that used to play for the Cowboys. The Cowboys definitely wanted to address the cornerback position. That was a position that they needed to improve and get another player, especially on defense. The Cowboys definitely wanted to improve their defense through the draft. The Eagles had the 53rd pick, and they landed up selecting quarterback Jalen Hurts. Many people, including myself, were really surprised that the Eagles selected a quarterback. The only thing that I could think of, since the Eagles selected a quarterback with this draft pick, is that the Eagles are potentially looking for a replacement for Carson Wentz, and Jalen Hurts is potentially going to replace Carson Wentz sometime down the road. Carson Wentz definitely has a long injury list, and he has definitely missed many games in part of a few seasons. So it kind of makes sense that the Eagles selected a quarterback that could back up Carson Wentz in case he gets injured. But it also tells me too that the Eagles are exploring other options that could potentially replace Carson Wentz, since they believe Carson Wentz may not be their franchise quarterback. So I was really surprised to see the Eagles select a quarterback with this draft pick. It even surprised me that the Eagles drafted a quarterback in this year's draft after they drafted Carson Wentz a few years ago, and Carson Wentz is supposed to be their franchise quarterback. The Ravens had the 55th pick, and they landed up selecting running back J.K. Dobbins. So with this draft pick, the Ravens landed up choosing an offensive player, and they landed up addressing the running back position that could potentially help improve the Ravens' offense and be another weapon for Lamar Jackson at the cornerback position. So the Ravens landed up drafting a running back with this draft pick, and they also gave another weapon that Lamar Jackson can use. And they're hoping by selecting a running back that their offense will be even better for this season and going into the future. And there's no doubt that the Ravens have a great offense, even from last season. And they're expecting the offense to be just as great. After the Ravens had a great offense last season, and even though their season ended when it wasn't supposed to, the Ravens have high expectations, especially for their offense this season and going into the future. And for this season, the Ravens are expecting their offense to be just as great or even better. The Ravens definitely have one of the best offenses in the NFL, especially after the way they played last season, which was led by quarterback Lamar Jackson. And the Ravens are hoping that their offense will be just as great this season and going into the future, which will be led by Lamar Jackson. But the Ravens wanted to address the running back position by adding another running back and by adding another weapon that Lamar Jackson can use on offense. So the Ravens have the potential of being better on offense, scoring more points, and winning games this season and going into the future. The Colts had the 122nd pick, and they landed up selecting quarterback Jacob Eason. So after the Colts had to move on from Andrew Luck, and they landed up picking up Phillip Rivers during free agency. Phillip Rivers is really only guaranteed for this season, and even if he continues playing in the NFL after this season, Phillip Rivers is really only guaranteed 1 or 2 more seasons before he decides to call it a career and retire from the NFL due to the age that he is. So the Colts was another team that many of us had linked to drafting a quarterback that could potentially be a replacement for Phillip Rivers and also be a franchise quarterback going into the future. So with this draft pick, the Colts landed up selecting a quarterback that could potentially be their franchise quarterback going into the future. But this quarterback is also going to have the opportunity to learn from Phillip Rivers. This season, Phillip Rivers will be the Colts quarterback. And going into the future, once Phillip Rivers moves on from the Colts or retires from the NFL, the Colts are hoping that quarterback Jacob Eason can be their franchise quarterback going into the future. The Bills had the 167th pick, and they landed up selecting quarterback Jake Forum. Many others, including myself, were surprised that the Bills decided to select a quarterback with this draft pick. After the type of season that the Bills had last season and the potential they have for this season and going into the future, after the Bills drafted Josh Allen in the last few years, many people are expecting Josh Allen to be their franchise quarterback going into the future. So it really didn't make sense as to why the Bills drafted a quarterback, since Josh Allen is potentially going to be their franchise quarterback going into the future. The only thing that I could think is that the Bills were looking for a backup quarterback to back up Josh Allen. Here is who the Broncos drafted in this year's draft. With the 15th pick, they selected wide receiver Jerry Jeudy. With the 46th pick, they selected wide receiver KJ Hamler. With the 77th pick, they selected cornerback Michael Otuma. With the 83rd pick, they selected center Lloyd Cushenberry. With the 95th pick, they selected defensive tackle McTeen Algame. With the 118th pick, they selected tight end Albert Okwuegbunam. With the 178th pick, they selected linebacker Justin Smone. With the 181st pick, they selected guard Netan Munti. With the 252nd pick, they selected wide receiver Tyree Cleveland. And with the 254th pick, they selected outside linebacker Derek Tuska. The Broncos got graded an A for the players they selected in this year's draft. So if we take a look at the Broncos, in the 2020 NFL Draft, the Broncos definitely improved their team both on offense and defense, and they had another successful NFL Draft in 2020, just like they did in 2019. According to multiple reports, many people and organizations graded the Broncos with an A for the players they selected and for the type of draft class that they had in 2020. And there's no doubt that the Broncos improved their team both on offense and defense, but especially on offense. The Broncos are hoping that they have a better season in 2020. In this year's draft class, in the 2020 NFL Draft, the Broncos selected some of the best prospects in this year's draft class. The Broncos' main goal was to improve their offense, especially get more receivers for Drew Lock and also get protection for Drew Lock, which they did accomplish that. We're just going to have to wait and see how their prospects play, regardless if it's the offense or defensive players that they selected in the 2020 NFL Draft. But overall, the Broncos had another successful draft in 2020, just like they did in 2019. And the Broncos selected a lot of great individual players, regardless if they're offense or defensive players. We're going to have to wait and see how these individual players perform this season and going into the future, and if they'll end up being potential starters on the Broncos offense or defense and have an impact for the Broncos on offense or defense, depending on what player it is for this season or going into the future. But there's no doubt that the Broncos selected great individual players both on offense and defense, and they're hoping that these players will have an impact on their team on offense or defense, depending what player it is and what position they play. And they're hoping that these players will have an impact on their team for this season and going into the future. And the Broncos are also hoping that they're a better team this season and going into the future. And their goals for 2020 and for this season is to be a better team on offense and defense, but especially on offense. The Broncos want to be able to score more points, win more games, and the Broncos want to get back into the playoffs this season. So we're going to have to wait and see how the Broncos play this season. But there's no doubt that this offseason, during free agency and during the draft, that the Broncos definitely improved their team, both on offense and defense. The Ravens, Colts, Vikings, and the Broncos got graded an A for the players they selected in this year's draft and for having the top draft classes in 2020. The Bills, Bengals, Browns, and the Cowboys got graded a B for the players they selected in this year's draft and for having the top draft classes in 2020. So there's no doubt that the 2020 NFL draft was a great draft class, especially with the top prospects. And the 2020 NFL draft is going to be remembered for the amount of wide receiver depth it had and for the amount of wide receivers that were in this year's draft class and for the wide receivers that got drafted. And there's no doubt, regardless if it's offense or defensive players, a lot of great prospects were drafted in this year's draft. But unfortunately, there were prospects that didn't get drafted. And the prospects that went undrafted, it's not the end of the road for them. As long as a team picks them up and gives them a chance, just like the players that got drafted are getting a chance, an undrafted player that can show the capability that they have of playing in the NFL, regardless of what team picks them up, could have the opportunity, just like a drafted player, of being able to play in the NFL. And regardless of what player it is, no matter if they were drafted or undrafted, we have seen many great players that have been some of the best players to ever play in the NFL, and some of those players were also named Hall of Famers. And believe it or not, regardless if it's players that were drafted, especially players in the first round, we have seen a lot of great players that were also some of the best players that ever played in the NFL, and they were also named Hall of Famers. But the undrafted players that had the opportunity and that were given a chance by a team, we have seen a lot of undrafted players have the opportunity of playing in the NFL and also being one of the best players to ever play in the NFL. And there are a lot of undrafted players that have made it into the Hall of Fame. So even for the players that went undrafted, it's not the end of the road for them, and as long as they get an opportunity, even from one team, you never know. They can have the opportunity of being one of the best players to ever play in the NFL and also be a future Hall of Famer. And there's no doubt that in the last few seasons and in the past, especially for the Broncos have picked up a lot of undrafted players that landed up being some big name players for the Broncos on offense and defense, and also being some of the best players to ever play for the Broncos, and some of those players have made their way into the Hall of Fame. So even though a drafted player has an advantage, it doesn't mean that a player that went undrafted, it's the end of the road for him. As long as that undrafted player gets the opportunity and they show what they're capable of, just like a drafted player, an undrafted player could also show their potential in the NFL. And we have definitely seen that in the past, and we're going to continue seeing that going into the future. At the end of the 2020 NFL Draft, all 32 teams are hoping that they improve their team for this season and going into the future, regardless of what player they were able to select and draft in this year's draft. And all 32 teams are hoping that they improve their team both on offense and defense for this season and going into the future. And all 32 teams hope that they're better for this season especially and going into the future. So they have the potential of scoring a lot of points, winning a lot of games, making it into the playoffs, but also all 32 teams want to have the chance at potentially reaching and winning this season's Super Bowl or any other Super Bowls going into the future. So now that the 2020 NFL Draft has come to an end and it has now passed, here's what's to watch for in the next few weeks. The release of the 2020 schedule for all 32 teams, the schedule for the offseason, which will include OTAs, minicamp, and training camp. How is the offseason going to play out due to the coronavirus? We're just going to have to wait and see. It's all going to come down to how this coronavirus plays out for the next few weeks and even for the next few months. When will the 2020 season begin due to the coronavirus? We're going to have to wait and see. There's no doubt that the off-season is going to be affected by the coronavirus. We're likely not going to see OTAs and minicamp. There's the potential of not seeing training camp. Also, there could be a delay to the start of the 2020 season, but many individuals, including myself, do see a 2020 NFL season happening, even if we have to wait until sometime towards the end of 2020. But we do see a 2020 NFL season happening. There is the possibility of it being delayed and starting sometime towards the end of 2020 and overlapping into the first few months of 2021. But I do see a 2020 season happening. There's no doubt that the coronavirus will affect the off season, just like it did affect free agency in the NFL draft, and it's probably going to affect the off-season programs, which includes OTAs, minicamp, and potentially training camp. It could also affect the start of the 2020 season. We're just going to have to wait and see how the coronavirus plays out for the next few weeks and for the next few months. And depending on the coronavirus pandemic situation that is currently happening right now, sometime in the next few months, but by this summer, there should be a better idea of when the 2020 NFL season will start and if fans will be allowed to attend any NFL game or be able to attend a game and be inside a stadium. We're just going to have to wait and see how the coronavirus pandemic plays out for the next few weeks, but especially going into the next few months. There's no doubt that the coronavirus is affecting the NFL, even though the NFL is in the off season. And the coronavirus definitely has the potential of affecting the season once it starts, or even once it's supposed to start, and we could definitely see a delay to the start of the 2020 season. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens going into the next few months. Also, we're going to have to wait and see what happens with the remaining free agents still available on the market, which includes Cam Newton, Andy Dalton, and Joe Flacco. So that's what's to watch for in the next few weeks. The 2021 NFL Draft will be in Cleveland There will be a lot of great prospects in this draft class, which will include the number 1 prospect, quarterback Trevor Lawrence from Clemson, and he is projected to be the first overall pick in the 2021 NFL Draft. The 2023 NFL Draft will be in Kansas City. The NFL announced Las Vegas will host the 2022 NFL Draft after Las Vegas was not able to host the 2020 NFL Draft due to the coronavirus pandemic. And we're also hoping that the 2021 NFL Draft will take place in Cleveland next year. And hopefully it's not going to land up being the way that the 2020 NFL Draft was. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens with the coronavirus pandemic. Right now I'm going to take a commercial break. When I come back, I will talk about the end of the show. Welcome back to All Sports with Gerardo. Moving on now, on the next show I will talk about NFL football, Major League Baseball, and NBA basketball. I hope you all have a great week. Tune in to the next All Sports with Gerardo show next week. I want to say thank you to everybody that listens to All Sports. Subscribe or like my pages on social media at All Sports with Gerardo. Until next time, this is Gerardo.